A red haze clung to the horizon, as if the sun itself had blood across the sands. The desert wind carried the echo of hoofbeats and the silent promise of death. Before dusk was through, she would either negotiate a fragile peace with the Apache or perish of thirst in this land that swallowed the weak. In the southern reaches of the Arizona Territory, the desert stretched wide and merciless. Pale dust coated every rock and thornbush, and the towering saguaros stood like mute sentinels beneath a punishing sun. This portion of the territory was a crucible of extremes: breathtaking sunsets, glorious star-strewn nights, and days so hot and arid that breath felt like fire in one's lungs. A single stagecoach trail cut across this domain, linking a distant army fort to a handful of outposts and ranches. Weeks could pass without a single traveler braving the route. The local word called it the Dead Road, for it led into territories fiercely contested by the Apache bands, who had lived here long before any new settler dreamed of taming the land. In the swirl of politics, raids, and cavalry patrols, the frontier faced an uneasy balance between survival and annihilation. Just off this lonely trail stood a small adobe station, a way stop for the stagecoach line whenever it dared pass through. The station itself was barely more than a two-room shack with a sagging roof and a rickety corral. A shallow well, now nearly bone dry from drought, was all that kept it functional. Over the door a chipped sign read, "Sonora Way Station." In cracked paint, though many joked it should read, "No Hope Here." Inside on a scorching summer day, Julia Alcott labored at a makeshift desk. She was 29 years old, with braided black hair streaked by the sun and a slender build made leaner by the hardships of desert living. Once a seamstress in Tucson, she had arrived at this outpost with her new husband, Thomas Alcott, a year ago. They had planned to run the station for a short time, hoping to save enough money to buy a piece of farmland further north. But the desert had proven relentless. Over the months, bandits had raided their stores, the well had collapsed twice, and Thomas had taken ill, eventually succumbing to fever. That had been 3 months ago. Julia, refusing to abandon her husband's dream, remained. Day by day, she sold meager supplies to the occasional traveler and tried to nurse the well back to life. But the unstoppable drought had lowered the water table, leaving her to wrestle with her greatest fear, that she would die alone here, unremembered, having achieved nothing but heartbreak. Still she pressed on, hoping that one day the rains would return, or a buyer would come along to take the station off her hands, so she might return to civilized territory. But she couldn't shake the loyalty she felt to Thomas's memory and to the idea that the desert, harsh though it was, possessed a raw beauty worth preserving. That conflict churned in her chest each morning when she tasted the dryness in the air. She wore a single silver chain around her neck, a keepsake from her wedding day, as if it alone tethered her to hope. Into this parched world rode Sergeant Benjamin Kane of the U.S. Army Cavalry. Tall, broad-shouldered, and bearing the etched lines of a soldier who had seen too many skirmishes, he was in his mid-30s. His face was tanned and stern, but his eyes held a hidden gentleness. Kane had been assigned to ferry dispatches between Fort Bowie and Fort Lowell. Rumors of Apache unrest turned a routine ride into a dangerous mission. Kane's goal was straightforward: deliver crucial orders that might decide whether reinforcements arrived to quell rising tensions. But deep down, his fear was personal. Over a decade of service on the frontier had worn away his illusions. He dreaded losing his moral compass in a conflict that sometimes pitted him against the land's original inhabitants, people he had come to respect, even if he was duty-bound to fight them. On a blistering noon, Kane rode his bay mare up to Sonora Way Station, thirst burning his throat. He rapped on the door, calling out for water, finding it barely ajar. Inside was a woman, heartbreak shadowing her eyes. Their meeting was abrupt, neither expecting the other, but the land had a way of thrusting strangers into alliances built on necessity. Julia offered him a ladle of meager water. "You're lucky. The well's still yielding." "Barely," she said, her voice tinged with a dryness that betrayed her own thirst. As he drank, she noticed the seriousness in his gaze, the slight tremor in his hands. Even cavalry soldiers were not immune to the desert's wrath. He thanked her, then mentioned hearing rumors of Apache sightings along the route. She swallowed hard, recalling the last traveler's warning that a band of Chiricahua Apache had been spotted near the canyons west of the station. "I've seen smoke signals from the ridge," she said quietly. "We keep to ourselves, but they're out there." Their conversation carried an undercurrent of apprehension. He needed to push onward with his dispatches, but traveling alone was perilous. She needed help. The station was on the brink of ruin, and a strong ally, especially a cavalry sergeant, might be her best chance of surviving the next wave of trouble, whether from outlaws or unrest. Neither voiced it yet, but a fragile partnership began to form, sealed by the unrelenting sun overhead and the faint hope they could outlast the drought. The desert heat had only intensified. Cracks spider-webbed across the station's adobe walls, and Julia's few remaining barrels of water were down to a precious trickle. Sergeant Kane, having decided to rest his horse and gather intelligence, remained at the station for a brief respite. Each evening he and Julia would sit on the porch, gazing at the star-flung sky, sipping from tin cups of tepid water. A sense of uneasy camaraderie took root, but each day brought ominous signs. Far off to the west, dust clouds hinted at riders on the move. Whether bandits or Apache scouts, no one knew. Meanwhile, the few passers-by who straggled into the station told grim tales. Soldiers skirmishing with a band of warriors led by a fierce Apache war leader. Crops withering in the fields for lack of rain. Families fleeing to safer lands. Tension coiled in the scorching air like a rattlesnake about to strike. It was late afternoon when a man stumbled into Sonora Way Station. He wore tattered clothes and had sun-cracked lips. Julia rushed to offer him water. Sergeant Kane, seated on a small stool, studied the stranger's hollow-eyed expression. The man introduced himself as Lewis Garner, a prospector who had tried to cross the desert alone in search of rumored silver veins near the Huachuca Mountains. Garner's voice was ragged as he spoke. "Bandits robbed me, left me for dead." He gasped, clutching the canteen. "Might have also been Apaches I didn't see. They took my horse." Julia's heart clenched, another life shattered by the cruelty of the desert. She helped him inside, letting him rest on a cot. Sergeant Kane pressed for details. "Where exactly were you attacked? Were they definitely Apache?" Garner's eyes flicked with fear. "I can't say for sure. Wore bandanas over their faces. Could be outlaws. Could be renegades." He shuddered. "They shot at me, took my horse. I barely escaped. Please, you've got to get me safe passage out of here." Kane's jaw tightened. "I can't promise you an escort. My duty is to carry dispatches between the forts. But if we cross paths, I'll do what I can." Julia felt torn. She loathed refusing anyone in such need. But the station's water was nearly gone. Adding another mouth to feed was a gamble. Still, she couldn't banish him, not in good conscience. She whispered to Kane that Garner could stay a day or two, recover. Then, hopefully, he might join a stagecoach or some other passing group. Kane agreed with reluctance, aware of the station's frailty. That night, as Garner slept fitfully, Julia and Kane exchanged grim looks over the last of the beans in the pantry. "We can't sustain this place much longer," Julia admitted, voice choked. "Every day without rain brings me closer to ruin." Kane looked at her haunted expression. He thought of her unwavering will, staying out here alone, determined to keep the station alive. Something stirred in him, a protectiveness he rarely allowed himself to feel. "We'll figure something out," he said softly. Have to reassure her, have to reassure himself. Outside, the wind rattled the station's shutters, and dust devils danced across the moonlit ground. Time seemed suspended in suffocating heat. Garner's condition improved slightly, though he remained weak. Sergeant Kane prepared to depart at dawn. He had a narrow window to deliver his dispatches, messages that might shape the Army's response to rising Apache hostilities. Julia felt an ache at the thought of him leaving. His presence, though brief, had brought a sense of solidity to her precarious life. In the middle of the night, A faint rumbling echoed across the desert. Thunder, perhaps. Julia rushed outside, scanning the sky with desperate hope for rain. But the clouds were thin and scattered, yielding only a few drops that sizzled on the hardpan. She stood with tears blurring her vision, whispering prayers for a storm that never came. Cain approached, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said. "If I had power over the weather." She turned to him, forcing a wry smile through her tears. "I know. None of us do." Her voice quivered. "I can't keep living on false hope. The well is almost dust, Sergeant." He nodded, understanding the unspoken question. Should she finally abandon the station? But her eyes shone with stubborn defiance. "Thomas and I built this place," she whispered. "I can't just walk away, not yet." Early the next morning, Cain saddled his horse, preparing to ride. Garner insisted on accompanying him, hoping to reach a safer outpost. Julia helped them pack leftover biscuits and a few canteens. As the two men rode off, she stood at the threshold, heart heavy with a mixture of anxiety and an unexpected longing. For what, she wasn't sure. A friend? A protector? Maybe something deeper. Hours later, as the sun climbed mercilessly overhead, Julia heard shouts from the distance. Startled, she grabbed her rifle and stepped onto the porch. Sergeant Cain and Garner were galloping back at breakneck speed. Dust billowed around them. Cain dismounted in a flurry. "Outlaws," he panted. "Or Apache scouts. Not sure. We saw riders near the ridge. They fired on us." Garner's face was pale with fear. "The route east is blocked," he gasped. "We retreated before they could pick us off." Julia's pulse quickened. "So we're trapped." Cain slid a glance at the horizon. "Likely pinned down. If it's a large group, we can't outfight them with just the three of us." He exhaled. "We need a new plan, maybe heading north, risking the canyons. But that terrain's tough, and we don't know how many are out there." As if to punctuate his words, the distant crack of a rifle echoed. They all tensed. A bullet whined overhead, striking the ground near the station. Panic seized Garner's eyes, and he bolted inside. Julia's heart pounded. She locked eyes with Cain, seeing a flicker of grim resolve in him. "Get cover?" he said, and they hurried into the station, bracing themselves for a possible standoff. But no further shots came. Instead, the land fell into an ominous hush. They dared not leave the station, suspecting watchers might lurk in the rocks. With their water nearly gone, they faced an impossible situation: stay put and die of thirst, or venture into the crosshairs. As the blazing sun sank lower, the oppressive heat forced them to ration every sip. Garner lay in a corner, drenched in sweat. Cain paced near the window, scanning the horizon. Julia, rifle across her lap, prayed for a miracle. Suddenly, a shape moved beyond the station yard. A lone Apache scout, approaching on foot with deliberate caution, arms raised in a gesture that suggested parley. He was young, with lean, sinewy limbs and a face set in calm determination. Cain tensed, readying his revolver. "Let's see what he wants." "Don't fire unless threatened," he told Julia quietly. They stepped onto the porch, hands visible, hearts hammering. The young Apache called out in his own language, his voice low and firm. Cain, who knew a smattering of the dialect from past interactions, offered a few careful words back. They managed a halting exchange. Julia watched, breath tight, uncertain if this was a trick. Eventually, Cain turned to her, face lined with tension. "He says his name is Nanton from a Chiricahua band. He claims his people are camped not far from here. They're short on water, too. He knows we have a well." Cain paused, swallowing hard. "He wants to talk." Julia glanced over her shoulder at the meager well. "What do we have left to give?" she whispered. "Not much. But maybe we can find a truce. If they want the well, they might also help us break free of whichever bandits are out there." Garner hissed in alarm from inside. "You can't trust them! They'll kill us! They all want us gone." He clutched his side, still trembling, but Julia saw a flicker of a different possibility in Cain's eyes, an uneasy but potential alliance in a land that threatened them all. So began a tense negotiation. Nanton motioned for them to follow at a distance to a small grove of mesquite where an elder awaited. With dryness parching her throat, Julia joined Kane, leaving Garner behind to guard the station. Step by cautious step, they ventured from the porch, every sense on alert for ambush. Under the mesquite trees, they found an older Apache woman wrapped in a woven blanket, hair streaked gray. She called herself Chokwa, Nanton's aunt. Through halting words and gestures, Kane explained they were trapped by unknown riders and the station's well was nearly dry. Chokwa's eyes, dark with sorrow, roamed over the desert. She spoke a phrase to Nanton, who translated with difficulty. She says, "All of us thirst. Your station is not enough water for many, but maybe we share. Keep watch for enemies. Survive together." Julia's breath caught. She had never dreamed of forging an alliance with the very people some in the territory considered enemies. Yet she felt the raw truth in the older woman's words. The desert was ruthless to all. If they fought each other, thirst and death would claim them faster. Kane asked about the riders beyond the ridge. Nanton indicated that his band had also spotted them. Likely outlaws who had taken advantage of the region's chaos to terrorize travelers and Apaches alike. They had no affiliation with the larger Apache resistance. These were men who raided whoever was vulnerable. The war parties that roamed the region were a separate threat entirely. But these particular raiders endangered both sides. In that swirl of sun and desperation, an agreement emerged: the Apache would not attack the station. Julia, Kane, and Garner would share what meager water they had for now. Nanton's band, in turn, would help stand guard against the raiders. If water could be found deeper in the desert, perhaps an underground spring or hidden pool, they would share it, a temporary alliance precarious as a desert flower after rain. The next morning arrived in a blaze of pink and gold. Sleep had been scarce. The night was filled with uneasy watch shifts, tense conversations, and the endless question, would the outlaws strike at dawn? But the horizon remained quiet. In the dawn's faint light, Chokwa and several Apache families arrived near the station seeking shade. Julia saw the thinness of children's limbs, their desperate eyes. These were not the savage characters spun by rumor. They were families clinging to survival, just as she was. Sergeant Kane paced near the well, half-lidded eyes revealing his own exhaustion. He had decided to remain at the station a bit longer. His dispatches, though urgent, might never reach their destination if outlaws seized the road. Julia, meanwhile, scrounged what little supplies she could share with Chokwa's people. A few more precious gallons of water were hauled up from the well's meager depths, distributed among the Apache, and set aside for the station's own use. Mid-morning, the scorching sun rose higher. Suddenly, a thunder of hooves rang out, echoing off the hard terrain. Julia rushed out to see a group of horsemen cresting a nearby hill. 4 or 5, some wearing ragged clothes, brandishing rifles. Her heart seized. She spotted the flash of sun on a gun barrel. The outlaws had come. Nanton and several Apache men armed with bows and a few rifles spread out around the station. Kane barked for Garner to take position behind a stack of crates. Julia grabbed her rifle, heart pounding so hard she could barely think. A single shot cracked through the still air, the bullet kicking up dirt near an Apache youth. The next moments blurred in an eruption of gunfire. The raiders circled wide, seeking vantage points. Kane returned fire from the porch, while Nanton and another brave fired from behind the corral. Dust billowed, and the horses neighed in panic. Julia crouched behind a barrel, rifle trembling in her hands. Her breath came in short gasps as she witnessed the clash of two desperate groups, each fighting to claim or protect scarce resources. She spied the tall figure of a bandit who had singled out Nanton, leveling his rifle. Without pausing, Julia fired. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, and the bandit flinched as dust rose around his horse. Her shot missed by an inch, but it forced him to retreat behind a mesquite tree. In that instant, a searing pain stung her calf, a stray bullet grazing her. She cried out, biting down on her lip. She collapsed onto the porch, vision swimming. She pressed a hand to the wound, feeling the hot trickle of blood. Panic threatened to consume her, but she steeled herself. She couldn't succumb to shock. Not now. The exchange of fire intensified. Arrows whistled, occasionally finding their mark. One of the raiders tumbled from his horse, clutching a wound. Another circled back, trying to flank the Apaches. The station yard became a swirling chaos of dust, bullets, and swirling cloak of fear. Garner, pinned behind crates, stared at Julia's injury with wide eyes. "God, we're done for?" he wailed, retreating further. Some primal surge of anger coursed through Julia. She was done with being helpless. Summoning her last reserves, she repositioned, took aim at a bandit who was reloading near the well, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, striking him in the shoulder. He toppled with a scream. Amid the chaos, the largest bandit, bearded, scarred, spurred his horse toward the open desert, yelling for the others to fall back. Sensing the tide turning against them, the outlaws began a disorganized retreat. Nanton shouted in Apache, rallying his band. Kane fired one last shot, dropping another raider's horse. The rest thundered away, leaving behind 2 wounded outlaws. For a moment, everything fell silent except for the hiss of wind and the groans of the injured. The Apaches tensed, bows drawn, eyes flicking to Kane for guidance. Garner, still trembling, emerged from the crates. Julia pressed a cloth to her bleeding calf, heart still hammering. Now came the moral crossroad: what to do with the wounded raiders. One outlaw, chest heaving, stared defiantly at them. The other lay unconscious. Chokwa approached, face inscrutable. A hush fell as Apache men and the ragged defenders of the station formed a ragged semicircle around the fallen enemies. Nanton's rifle was raised, anger simmering in his eyes. The simplest choice in this savage land was to end them, ensuring no future threat. Yet, Julia felt a jolt of empathy, even for these men who had tried to kill them. The desert's thirst, the desperation, it drove them all to brutal acts. She forced herself to speak through the pain. "Don't kill them," she rasped. "They're beaten." Nanton turned to Kane, uncertain. Sergeant Kane exhaled, stepping forward with his jaw clenched. "She's right," he said softly. "No more blood. We have enough on our hands." He knelt, retrieving the outlaws' guns, making sure they were disarmed. Chokwa observed them for a long moment. Finally, she inclined her head. In a halting phrase, she expressed acceptance. The Apaches, who could have demanded violent retribution, chose to trust this fragile alliance. The 2 wounded raiders, angry, silent, were left alive. That single act, forging mercy in the midst of dust and blood, marked a turning point in the small patch of desert they all called home. The aftermath was grim. One Apache youth lay wounded, an arrow in his thigh. Julia's calf burned with each step, and supplies were scarce. Kane improvised bandages from the station's meager store of cloth. Chokwa comforted the youth, chanting quiet prayers. Garner, eyes wide, slumped against the station's wall, reflecting on how near to death they'd come. In the days that followed, the scorching sun continued to blaze. Yet, something changed in that patch of dust. The outlaws had fled, leaving behind an uneasy calm. The Apaches helped fortify the station's perimeter, stacking rocks to form a makeshift protective ring. Julia, recovering slowly, found a sense of purpose beyond simple survival, forging understanding with people she had once known only through rumor. Sergeant Kane, pressing to complete his mission, was finally able to travel north, with Nanton guiding him along a safe route away from lurking dangers. Kane promised to deliver the station's plight to the Army command. Though he could not guarantee cavalry support, he vowed to speak for the necessity of peace and recognition of mutual survival. With a quiet handshake, he bid Julia farewell, neither certain when they might see each other again. And so, under the desert's relentless glare, a fragile community found renewed hope. The well was still low, the drought had not broken, but in the hearts of those who had fought side by side, Julia, Chokwa, Nanton, even the reluctant Garner, there was a shared realization that in the face of thirst and danger, unity was their best chance. In their daily prayers for rain, they found a reason to stand together, if only for one more day. Sometimes no force is harsher than a parched land that demands we either unite or perish. Lines drawn by fear and conflict can fade when faced with a greater, unrelenting foe. Thirst, isolation, the humbling might of nature. In the end, it is not just water that sustains life, but the mercy and cooperation we dare extend to one another, even when the desert itself seems bent on our destruction. True resilience lies in that choice to reach across divides, to forge hope amid the dust. Thank you for sharing in this tale of drought unity and survival on the American frontier. If Julia's courage and her unlikely alliance with the Apache moved you, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts on mercy and resilience. Your voice keeps the spirit of these stories alive in the desert wind. Safe travels, friends.